they do. Happy Monday, friends. So good to see you all. Welcome to Downtown Rotary. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please join me in reciting the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? I'd like to invite Laura Arnett for our invocation.
Please bow your heads with me if you wish. Let us pray silently together, each one of us according to our individual beliefs. Let us offer thanks for our food, blessings for one another. Let us be a source of hope for those in need and contentment for those who are lonely. Let us give gratitude for our opportunity to serve Rotary and our community. Let the feelings of love, kindness, and a well-directed yet gentle spirit always be reflected in our actions. Amen.
The number may have grown since I had a chance to glance at it before coming up here, but from what I understand, we have 12 guests with us today. For those of you I have not met, my name is Cindy Peterson. I have the pleasure of being president of Downtown Rotary this year. I would like to invite our guests to stand and invite the member who invited that individual. Please stand so we can thank you for spending your Monday with us. I also want to welcome one of our one of our junior Rotarians, Myrtle Parham of O'Gorman. With Sioux Falls Public Schools being off today, you can meet the rest of our junior Rotarians at our next meeting. We have two new member inductions. We'll do the first. I'd like to invite Jack Marsh up to introduce Carson Walker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my privilege to welcome my longtime friend and colleague, Carson Walker, as a member of Sioux Falls Downtown Rotary. Carson is the Chief Executive Officer of South Dakota News Watch, the state's first nonpartisan nonprofit news organization, which I helped to co-found in 2018. Nearly 350 in-depth projects and articles of statewide relevance have been produced by Newswatch journalists over the last 5 years. Carson is among the most accomplished and versatile journalists in our state, with 34 years of experience in media and in communications. Carson is a native of Hartley, Iowa, an alumnus of Colorado State University. He rose to prominence as a journalist in the state in the 1990s as an investigative reporter for the Sioux Falls Argus Leader and was involved in some of the major statewide stories at the time. He went from there to KDLT Television, where he was a reporter, producer, anchor, and eventually the news director of KDLT. And from there went on to the Associated Press, a distinguished 17-year career with the Associated Press, where he was a news correspondent, then an editor on the national filing desk, and also a director of all news coverage of the Associated Press in North Dakota and South Dakota. From there, he was lured by Jim Abbott and Tina Herrbolt to join the staff at the University of South Dakota, where he worked in university and media relations and also taught journalism in the Department of Media and Journalism at USD. And then from there, 6 years in corporate communications with Sanford Health. Carson joined South Dakota Newswatch as its first CEO in January. He is the father of 4 adult children and lives here in Sioux Falls. Please help me welcome Carson Walker.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. He is way too kind with the bio there. I do appreciate that, and it's great working with Jack again. I didn't think I was going to get back into journalism. I think it's one of those jobs, though, that when you really felt called to do that when I was a teenager, and had a great career in it, and am blessed to be back in it. Very humbled at the position, actually, and the opportunity to really go deep. A lot of journalism. There's a lot of new sites sprouting up. I think last week's panel discussion was a great example of that. You're seeing some really almost a revival of journalism, but it's not through all the traditional media. There's a lot of sites springing up, and so we're blessed to be able to really go deep. If you don't get our weekly emails, SD Newswatch is the website. You can sign up for free. You'll hopefully see more in-depth investigations, do more data journalism. And the idea with journalism really traditionally is to play that watchdog role. And I think at the national level, there's a lot of discourse. Obviously, it's been there's some really good stuff out there, but there's a lot of bad right now. On the local level, I really think that we're being able to really focus in on South Dakota. We can do a good job of fairly and objectively, as much as possible, cover the 3 branches of government and other aspects of society that make you all, and really all 800,000+ South Dakotans, better informed about what's going on. That really is the goal there. So acknowledging that we dangle on the bottom of the food chain as career surveys go. I worked in healthcare, though, for those years, and so I figured that ratcheted up a little bit in terms of overall respect there, but it's great to be back. I've been coming for a couple of weeks, and I got to tell you, I leave here intellectually and socially just blessed. And so thank you so much for all of you, and for letting me join you as well here every Monday. Thank you.
Our second new member induction, I'd like to invite Matt Paulson up to introduce Mike Ritter.
Thank you, President Cindy and fellow Rotarians. It is my pleasure today to introduce you all to Mike Ritter. Mike is the founder and principal at Blueprint Business Advisory, which is a boutique consulting firm that assists businesses with acquisitions, strategy, and growth. Mike is also the current volunteer board chair for Startup Sioux Falls. Mike is a graduate of Calvin College, where he has a degree in accounting. He also has an MBA from Notre Dame. Mike and his wife Kathleen have 2 children, Madison and Jacob. And they also have 2 pugs named Mocha and Latte. So please welcome Mike Ritter.
Thank you. I always get nervous when I follow up a communications guy, so I'm really brief and to the point. I'm a behind the scenes guy. I'm a finance guy as well, so I appreciate that you've welcomed me to your group. I look forward to serving along with everyone here, because downtown really has a great legacy of serving. So I appreciate, I look forward to serving along with you. I work with business owners primarily. I'm a number 2 guy, so I'm a behind the scenes guy as well. So I work with businesses on helping them grow, as well as either dispose of their business or acquire new businesses. So that's kind of my calling card. Thank you very much.
Carson, Mike, thank you both for sharing your talents and your servant leadership with Downtown Rotary. I'd like to invite our panelists and moderator up. While they make their way, I think we've all experienced week 1 of our membership drive, Show the Love. As a reminder, the new member fee is waived for those who apply between now and March 17th. A special thank you to our members. You are the ones who open the door, invite others to experience Downtown Rotary, and encourage them to consider joining. And with the attendance today, I think we're going to have a really, really fun month. I also want to remind the group that our More Than Mondays team has put together an In the Know for February 21st. Downtown Rotarians will get a tour of the Minnehaha County Juvenile Detention Center. So please consider signing up for that tour. If you have questions, you can touch base with Jen or with Angie. And I think, Jen, you've got a committee meeting afterwards today. And so certainly you'll be accessible and be available for conversation. And now for today's program. Blind spots, what you might be missing on the economic horizon. We have with us past President Jason Herrboldt. Thank you so much for putting today's program together. I will leave introductions and the program to you.
Thank you, President Cindy, and thank you, fellow Downtown Rotarians and guests for joining us today for this important discussion. I would like to begin by introducing our two panelists. The panelist to my far left is Jared McEntaffer, who is the CEO of the Dakota Institute for Business and Economic Analysis. His research fields include economic impact modeling, economic forecasting, regional labor market assessments, and treatment effect estimation. Jared earned his PhD from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Immediately to my left is Joe Santos, is the professor and Dykehouse Scholar in Money, Banking, and Regulation in the Ness School of Management and Economics at South Dakota State University, where he coordinates the Ness School's graduate programs. Joe teaches macroeconomics and monetary and financial economics. Areas of Joe's research include financial regulation and monetary policy. Joe is also the voice of Monday Macro, which airs on select Mondays on South Dakota Public Radio's In the Moment with Lori Walsh. Joe earned his PhD in economics from Rutgers University. Please join me in welcoming Jared and Joe.
Welcome, Joe.
So why are we here talking about blind spots? Well, I'm going to give you just a brief kind of overview of how we got here, and then we'll kick off the program. You know, everybody in this room probably attends a few cocktail parties or holiday parties over the during the Christmas season, and I am no different. And I got to thinking, as I attended all these holiday parties, I was just overwhelmed with optimism. You know, that on how well everything is going in Sioux Falls and in this region. And I just one night I was reflecting as I was going home, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, we got a good thing going. What are we missing? What are we missing that perhaps could give us some challenges? And you know, the last time I remember so many good things being talked about and almost unbridled optimism, and I'm an optimistic guy individually, you know, was you know, back in like 2007, 2008. And I was like, wow, I think it's time we probably bring some experts up, maybe when I get an opportunity to moderate again, and to just discuss some of the risks that maybe we are potentially not seeing as Sioux Falls continues to strive forward so positively and progressively. So, Jared and Joe, thank you for joining us today. Looking forward to this discussion and looking forward to what the two of you have to say about, you know, the state of affairs here in South Dakota and in this region from an economics perspective. Before we get started with the risks or blind spots, I want to define for the group what a blind spot is. Here's a textbook definition. An area where a person's view is obstructed. We all know what that means when we're driving down the road. We know what an obstruction looks like. That's a blind spot. The economic definition of a blind spot is conventional wisdom, which no longer holds true, but which still guides business strategy. So now when we get into the discussion of risks, I'm going to ask each of you, and I'll start with Jared, what is going well from your standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and what are our competitive advantages from your perspective, Jared?
Well, thank you, Jason. First, let me say I am very happy to be here with you today. I'm very happy that when Jason was having a wonderful Christmas season, full of optimism, that he decided to bring in two economists to rain on everyone's parade. So leaning into the dismal science stereotype for economists. And then also, I didn't get the memo on fun striped socks today, so I do apologize for that. These guys coordinated, but I didn't hear about it. So what's going well for South Dakota right now? I mean, it is a tremendous time right now. The growth in terms of business growth, profits, employment is very strong across the state. As the nation is taking sort of a slowdown, we've seen that in housing and construction, certainly. It hasn't impacted South Dakota yet. We're probably several quarters away from any sort of a major slowdown along those fronts. That's all well. I mean, the story that I think everyone sees and hears day-to-day basis, there's a lot of truth to that. Some of the headwinds that I see, or the sort of blind spots, are more long-term. They're the things that we're not really seeing yet because we're so focused on the good times that are here in front of us.
All right, thanks, Jared. Joe.
Yeah, and thank you for the invitation as well, and for the sock memo. Kept discreetly to myself. But yeah, I echo Jared's observations. Personal income in the state is, I think, something interesting to look at. And I want to say I want 2 bites of this apple, because this is the positive, and then I think there's some challenges associated with the very things I'm going to identify as positive. Personal income per capita in the state is actually exceeding right now the national average, right? So think like $66,000 per person versus $65,000 per person for the nation as a whole, which is really interesting. And if we decompose that into some of its parts, we see that some of this is because the employment rate is so high. So you have like a 2% unemployment rate, so you have a 98% employment rate. And you also have a very high labor force participation rate. So in some sense, we've got a lot going on. We're working a lot, and as a result of working so much, we're generating an enormous amount of personal income. Now, I should say inflation is eroding the purchasing power of everybody's personal income, so set that aside for the moment. But 2 drivers, labor participation and employment, are certainly contributing to this growth, and that's all good news, I think. And then the other one, again, I want a second bite at this apple too, but the other is just a mindset. I mean, you talk about optimism. I think there's real power in thinking optimistically. And Jake, we were joking about welfare theorems a moment ago, but I think there is this predisposition, if you will, in this part of the country to think, if we do have some sort of challenge, can the private sector solve it, right? And so I think that's the right initial orientation, is to think about how sort of free markets might be able to sort of come up with a solution to some sort of challenge that we face, as opposed to placing the burden of proof on those markets. So I think that mindset is powerful. Again, I want a second bite at that, because poison's in the dose, and I'll come back to that. But I think that's a real tailwind, if you will.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I'm gonna start with you. All of us here in this room are leaders in our respective businesses or nonprofits, and we're focused on, yes, seeing the big picture, but running the business. And as economists, the 2 of you have the ability to, your work involves you flying at a higher altitude, and at that higher altitude, you have a sight of perhaps some risks on the horizon that we maybe don't have. So, Joe, in your view, what is the number one concern as it pertains perhaps to our economic future?
Sure. So now for that second bite, right? So personal income per capita exceeds national levels of personal income per capita. And 2 of the drivers I mentioned are employment rates and labor force participation rate. The third factor is productivity. Is labor productivity, and there we do not exceed the nation. So labor productivity is, relatively lower than national levels of labor productivity, and this, I think, goes back to a larger challenge that we're going to face in this region, and that is just the tightness in the labor market is something that can at some point, or perhaps it's already constraining the growth. And the optimism I talked about and the mindset I talked about is all great, but you can't do anything without labor. And here the challenge, I think, is attracting labor generally, but then there's a complementarity between having a job and having a place to live. And that's where I think maybe we need to start thinking about public policy a little more seriously, where perhaps we need to set the means up for success in terms of housing in the region, so that individuals are able to support the economy in the way we want them to. So I think that's a challenge, and the reason it's such a big challenge is it's not necessarily what's been going on, let's say, within this region only. This is decades and decades old, and it's national. Public policy has for many, many decades been directed toward home ownership, and often single-family home ownership and home ownership in homes off of exchanges on interstates and so forth. It sort of shaped the way our residential life looks. And it had to do with low interest rates and the 30-year mortgage and all these sorts of innovations. And now we find ourselves, I think, in a situation where we have this sort of residential patchwork throughout the country, in this region of the country as well. And we're wondering why we can't sort of push against this and provide, whether it's mixed use or whatever the case may be, housing. So I think that's a challenge that we have to think about as a country, is how we're going to deal with this, because it's not unique to this region.
Can you, for the group's benefit, just kind of break down the definition of productivity as you described it?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So think about stuff per hour worked. I mean, that's essentially it. So if you take something really aggregate and messy like gross domestic product, and that's not necessarily what you would use in the numerator, but take that and divide it by all of the hours worked, you get stuff per hour. And so stuff per hour productivity, and particularly the growth in productivity, depends on human capital, and it also depends on the sort of circumstances in which labor lives outside of the workforce. And so again, things like reliable housing and so on, but also education. These are the sorts of things that drive labor productivity. And so, if I may, the second bite of that public policy apple earlier, I think we start from a position of thinking, what can the private sector do to solve all of this? But then I think we also have to realize if the assumptions we're making about the way the private sector works, it's perfect information and there's a market for everything and there are no externalities and all's right with the world. If that's not true, then we maybe have to start to think about how we fill those gaps with policy to support, for example, growth in labor productivity through education or training or whatever the case may be.
Jared, when you think about this in your work, how do you tie out productivity and housing? And do you see a gap there that needs to be addressed from a public policy standpoint?
I do. Excellent points, Joe. And every one of those I would like to chew on a little bit. But to keep things contained, productivity. If you look at South Dakota, as Joe said, we have a very high labor force participation rate. It's 2-3 points above the national average. The employment to population ratio, which is even more 10,000 foot, just the number of people working divided by the number of people, right? So that's really, really key ratio. That's higher than the national average. South Dakota also, from I think 2010 to 2017, most recent year, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did this analysis. South Dakota had the highest percentage of the workforce where you had multiple job holders. So if you think about our productivity, we have everyone working. We have more like 8 to 10% of the population with multiple jobs, right? That's unusually high compared to the rest of the nation. So we're maxed out and we have that lower productivity. So it really does come down to a population issue where we don't have the people to grow. And I really do think that we are seeing sort of limitations on our growth potential due to just that problem. We don't have enough workers. Our population isn't growing fast enough, either naturally or via net migration inwards to the state. And part and parcel with that, when you get to some of the public policy issues or the ramifications there, are the education system. How are we taking young people from the school system and getting them ready for the workforce? We've seen a lot of changing emphasis in the state, looking to more of the technical schools and trade education, and how can maybe we pull on some of those levers. And I think that we need to kind of continue with that, but we still have a problem with people coming of working age and leaving the state. And we need to have a better, I guess, economy for those folks so that they're more willing to stay here. Because I mean, that's one of the easiest things we can do. It's hard to get people to move from Arizona to South Dakota. It seems to always work the other way around, right? We want to keep the people here so they're not moving at the age of 22 to Chicago or to Atlanta or anything like that. So that's, I think, where we really can potentially have some impact.
population growth, and you made the comment about Arizona. All of us have anecdotal examples of people we've ran into or we hear about moving into South Dakota, during the pandemic. Is that a myth or a reality? I mean, did we have a flood of people, or was it a brief sugar rush, and is it sustainable?
We did have a flood of people. Net migration did increase for the last 2 years. I don't think it's going to continue forever. But the problem is the people that moved in tended to be 60 years old and older. Right? We didn't have a flood of young families moving to South Dakota. It was a flood of 70-year-olds coming to the state. For whatever reason, they decided they wanted the snow. I'm not sure. But that's the reality of that in-migration. So as much as we want those people here and we appreciate them coming here, they're not the sort of productive workers that are going to increase economic output and increase the growth potential of the state necessarily.
Joe, anything to add on that?
No, not really. I think that's exactly right. Both the population growth, the composition of that growth, and then the sort of the needs of the state to raise productivity. I think long term, this isn't something you're going to notice a change in from Monday to Friday, but it is a long term concern.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jared, your turn. When you ponder the risks to our long-term economic model or growth, what's on your mind?
So I guess I'll kind of build on where I was just at. The long-term, I think, headwind that faces the state is demographic, right? If you look back to, I'll just give you a couple of numbers. If you look to 2010, and you look at the breakdown of the South Dakota population, I'm just going to focus on the top of that. Everybody, think of a pyramid, right? So typically when a demographer or a part-time economist wants to think about this, think of a pyramid. So you want the population pyramid to be fat at the bottom, so you have lots of young kids and young families, and then the pyramid gets narrower towards the top, right? So if you look at sort of the population pyramid of South Dakota, in 2010, 10% of the population was 70 and older, right? By 2040, that's projected to be 15% of the population, right? So that's going to be an increase, goes from about 85,000 to around 150,000 residents. It's going to increase by about 70. That was the forecast. That was the projection. And forecasting out 25 years, 27 years, that's difficult. But in these sort of population demographics, it's not as bad as trying to forecast what the value of the dollar in 25 years is going to be. I mean, good luck. But so that's a real problem when we talk about growth potential for the state, when we talk about housing affordability. I know that's an issue that Joe has talked about. That's going to be a problem. So I'll give you one number. I wrote this down, right? Because sometimes it's good to write things down and consult your notes. So in 2010, roughly the state collected $670 million in sales taxes, okay? And that was 57% of the state's budget. In the same year, 2010, there was about 500,000 people in the state aged 20 to 70, okay? So think about that as the working age population. That's roughly $1,300 in sales tax per person at that point in time. Now, if you go out the 40 years, and we'll sort of assume the historical growth rate for taxes, that's 4.8% per year, constant annual growth rate. Forecast that out, you end up with roughly, adjust that for inflation, you're going to end up with about $1.5 billion in sales tax. So we're going to assume a 3% inflation rate. Is that safe? Higher than the Fed might like. I'm sure we would all like 3% inflation right now. But forecast that out. And then you look at the forecasted population in 2040. That's going to be roughly 615,000 individuals aged 20 to 70. So now you end up with taxes per worker of $2,400 in sales taxes per person in 2040. So we're talking about almost doubling the amount of sales tax collected per prime age worker in 2040. I mean, that's going to be a problem. It's not really feasible to assume that we can double the amount of sales tax collection per prime age worker between now and 2040. So that's a huge problem. When we look at the public finance, the school system, when we look at how are we going to fund infrastructure reinvestment in rural South Dakota, all of these sorts of issues. So it's a major, major headwind that I think it's a slow moving wave. And I think human beings are very poor in dealing with slow moving waves. It's just not the way we think, the Monday to Friday sort of change, if you will. We're talking about Monday to 15 years from now. And I think that's kind of what I think of.
Jill, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with Jared completely. And again, I come back to the other bit that I was discussing. All of that said, and then you still have relatively limited resources for government to deploy in ways that perhaps it might consider doing, right? So you don't have a very large tax base. Jared's speaking to the constraints imposed upon us based on the nature of that tax, consumption tax, and so forth. If we do determine that public policy is necessary to stimulate, whether it's productivity or housing or whatever the case may be, we don't have, if you will, in our arsenal the sort of resources necessary to do that based on that public finance method.
So when I listen, we have ourselves a population growth challenge, and we have a state funding challenge. Our state likes to manage at the local level. How does this funding challenge then bleed in at the state level, bleed into the county and city level? And is there some risk there that we should be thinking about?
I mean, I think you're right. What's the ramification at the state and county level, or excuse me, the municipal or the county level? There's a real danger that as we look at South Dakota now, how do most people think about South Dakota? There's sort of, well, I won't say most, some people. You've got Sioux Falls, you've got Rapid, and then there's stuff in between. And, for a few weeks every year, people think about Pierre, right? In 2040, what does that look like? What does the rest of that state look like? Because cities are economic engines. Sioux Falls, Rapid City are very strong engines. Mitchell, Aberdeen, Brookings, these are communities that are also strong engines. What about outside of that? What happens in some of these other counties where you've got, 500 people living in it? I want to ask people to raise their hands, but anyone driven Highway 14 from like Pierre to Rapid City? And right before you get to Wall, there's a town of Cottonwood. All right, I don't know if anyone's ever seen Cottonwood, but if you look at Cottonwood, the sign outside the town says population 9, right? There are probably 15 buildings in Cottonwood, 14 of which I would not want to spend the night in, right? Because they're falling apart. So what does it look like in 25 years from now if we have this population trend exiting the rural areas to the more urban areas? And what more of a challenge is that when the property tax base is falling apart, the sales tax base is falling apart? What is going to be the transfer mechanism to get funding from Sioux Falls or sales taxes or property tax revenues generated in the prosperous parts of the state to the less prosperous parts of the state? Because the market solution, I think, is that those areas are not viable outside of some sort of transfer mechanism. And I think it's a political discussion about whether the state wants to protect that or foster that sort of rural community, rural way of life, because there's the story out there of it's the post-pandemic world now and people work remotely, and as long as you've got an internet connection, you can work wherever you want. Who wants to work from Cottonwood? I mean, if they have a great internet connection, who wants to locate in that community? And are they really going to be able to recruit or attract people to that community? So that's a real challenge. I mean, what are we going to do to ensure, if that's the decision, that the sort of rural life can continue in some of these sparsely populated counties and municipalities?
Thanks, Jared. Joe, your areas of research include financial regulation and monetary policy. Monetary policy has been on the tip of everybody's tongue for the last 9 months. And what should we be thinking about there? And are there some risks or some headwinds that you think we should be contemplating here at a local level?
Sure. So here, this would not, almost by definition, be so much long-term, decades, because it's monetary policy and it's about business cycles and those things, particularly the contractionary stages of them or recessionary phases of them, tend not to last in years so much as months. But nevertheless, I think that's the sort of near-term risk right now we're facing, is an overreaction of monetary policy. So we're all hearing about these landings, they're soft landings, they're hard landings and all this. But really what we're talking about is a central bank that is trying to get a handle on an excessive fall in the purchasing power of money, right? Inflation is uncomfortably high. And really the only policy instrument, broadly speaking, that the central bank has available to it is the interest rate. And so, you know, everyone's been hearing about these increases in the Fed fund target range and so on. The challenge here is knowing how high to raise those interest rates. And while I don't know what the number is, and nor does the central bank, it's actually even a little harder, I think, than we realize, because what the central bank really needs to do, and this may seem sort of cruel and unusual, but they're trying to slow the growth in demand. And the way you do that is you really constrain credit. And right now, as high as we may think interest rates are going, we still have relatively high inflation. And so the real purchasing power attached to the burden of debt is really still not all that high. I pay you back in cheap dollars right now, right? So I don't know what the interest rate needs to be, but I know Jay Powell has made this comment once or twice as well. It certainly needs to be the case that the real interest rate, after we adjust for inflation, needs to be higher than it currently is, because right now that number is something like 0 or 0.5%. So they know they need to raise interest rates. I think the concern here is just that they overdo it, and overdoing it would just look like raising those rates so much that they essentially destroy demand and destroy employment and so forth in a way that just, it's not easy for the economy to recover from that, at least not very quickly. So that's the macroeconomic sort of monetary policy challenge at the moment. There are also fiscal budgetary challenges, things like debt ceiling arguments and so on. But for monetary policy, I think it's knowing how high to raise rates. And I should say there's a rather disturbing record attached to this, right? As macroeconomists enjoy saying that expansions they never die of old age, they're murdered, right? And so they're murdered because of excessively tight monetary policy. And the central bank has almost a perfect record of this since the Second World War. And so I don't mean to disparage the central bank. It's just really hard to know when to stop tightening because you're dealing with an enormous, what we call an outside lag. You raise rates and then it takes time for that to sort of percolate through the economy and reflect itself in the way of lower inflation, right? So they don't know when to stop in some sense. And so I think that's the risk.
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we'll talk about South Dakota being a bit insulated from these types of things, that you see extreme reactions to whatever policy or economic travesty that plays out. You'll see that kind of dwindle as it comes into the center of the country. Is that right?
Well, it is in some sense, in that if you think of a pie chart and you think of the wedges of the chart reflecting the amount of economic transactions associated with each industry wedge, our wedges look different, right? So agriculture, of course, plays an outsized role in this state relative to the nation and so on. So, in some sense, you expect there almost must be some sort of asymmetry, right? So the central bank's looking at the national economy, looking at things like real gross domestic product, looking at things like inflation, which is a purchasing power of money independently of what the money buys, doesn't matter where it is, it's sort of regionally agnostic. So they're looking at these national measures. Meanwhile, you've got an idiosyncratic economy, one that sort of doesn't look like the nation. So I would not be at all surprised. In fact, I expect that whatever the national economy does, you're likely to see some sort of asymmetric response at the regional level because, if, again, the central bank is tightening until overall sort of average economic activity slows enough to bring down inflation, well, we don't look like the average. And so it's not likely that we're going to experience this, certainly not at the same time. So I think that's a real thing because the composition of industries within the state just don't look like the composition of industries in the country. And that doesn't mean it's always a saving grace. I mean, there could be times when those industries that are outsized in the state are having trouble, and so we experience a downturn in the way that the nation does not. But at the moment, the outsized industries are actually doing rather well, all things considered, agriculture and so forth, and finance and insurance and real estate and healthcare and so on. And so right now, that asymmetry, I think, acts as maybe a tailwind is the wrong metaphor, but maybe a buffer, right? Some sort of shock absorber.
Mm-hmm. Jared, how does that play into your thinking when you look at the demographics of the state? You think about the industry makeup of the state. What's on your mind as it pertains to the actions that the Federal Reserve is taking right now with monetary policy?
I think Joe hits it pretty well. Our mix that we have here is, I'm not a finance guy, but if you're going to build your sort of portfolio and you maybe want a low volatility portfolio, that's kind of the industrial mix we have in South Dakota. That's good in downturns. It also means we don't get the upswing, so we don't have the dynamism that some other states have, which is, so it's good and it's bad. I think it's a trade-off. One thing I'm curious if Joe has thoughts on, but it seems like maybe a silver lining for the Fed. It just seems like this inflation is already starting to fade away on the wage growth. So it seems like, as bad as the inflation is, everyone hasn't sort of gone Chicken Little and said the sky is falling and we're going to have 10% inflation rates for the next 20 years and buy your toilet paper now, right? That doesn't seem to be the problem, which is I think Jay Powell and company are probably feeling pretty good about that. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's right. Team transitory will be right. You just got to wait long enough, right? But team transitory will be right. I think the nature of it, without going too deep into it, just in the interest of time, there's obviously there was the supply shock, and so you've got this demand going up against less supply, and so on. You get this inflation, but as those supply challenges begin to fade, and I'm not suggesting all is right now with the world, but they are fading. They don't seem to be intensifying. And you have a central bank that's fighting on the demand side. That's the only side, by the way, they can operate on, right? They can't stimulate supply. In terms of productivity or something like that, they have no levers of policy for that. But they can slow demand, and they're doing that. And yeah, I think we're noticing in all the data, whether it's the central bank's preferred measure of inflation or it's the more popular consumer price index, and we could lop off, sort of outliers and so on. And no matter what we do, there seems to be this sort of downturn in the growth rate, mind you. So it's still high growth in the price level, but it's not as high as it was. So there does seem to be something of a pattern to this. And I think the evidence in terms of the policy and the experience with the supply shocks that are now fading support this, that you would expect. I'm sort of joking, but only sort of, that it almost needs to be transitory based on its initial source. And then the rather, I think, aggressive policy response. Some might argue eventually, okay, they took long, but they eventually did tighten. And so I think that leads to ultimately a sort of transitory outcome.
Do either of you know, has our wage growth in South Dakota exceeded the national average, or is it running pretty much on point with what the national average has been seeing?
So that's a tough one. As Joe mentioned earlier, right now our per capita personal income is higher. But that's more than wages. That's sort of it's owners' compensation, it's workers' transfer payments. So that has been running higher than the national figure, and that is strange. That is strange to see that. But in terms of our average weekly wages or some of those measures, they're below the national average.
Okay. Joe, you commented on I think Jared, maybe you did, talked about the employment participation rate is a couple percentage points more than the national average. What does that mean, to productivity?
Yep.
What does that mean? And is there anything we should be mindful about? Is the churn within our employment base that is unproductive?
Yeah, so this churn, in some sense, you want churn. You want individuals to be searching out job opportunities where those individual skills are most used. And so, there's, as you would imagine, it would not be very productive from 55,000 feet, let's say, for individuals to remain in jobs when there are opportunities to move. So you want them to move, and that's churn. But of course, that churn works against recruitment, right, retention for the individual firm. And so I think, right now you've got a very tight labor market and you've got a lot of churn. And so I think, I'm guessing employers in the room would tell you that part of the frustration here is you train these workers and then they bail on you. In some sense, almost too much churn. And I think that needs to settle down a bit. But you brought up the employment to population ratio, and Jared did as well. Because the labor markets are so tight right now, I think this is just a sort of a consequence of that tightness in the labor market. Labor sees fit, perhaps, understandably, to move around a lot, and that could be destabilizing. I should say, no matter what, when we look at these very high employment to population ratios and so on, the challenge, and this was the downside I was referring to earlier, is that there is no way really for the supply of labor to easily accommodate the demand. So, at the very least, you've got to bid wages up. That's the only way to sort of auction that labor into employment. But even that becomes very difficult if you just do not have the labor force to draw in. And I think that's getting to where we're getting close to that point. Because again, 98% employment rates, very high labor force participation rates. You just don't have the bodies to draw into the service of labor. And so again, at the very least, I think you're going to see, you would need to see upward pressure on wages to call that labor forth. And so, that's a challenge for firms for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm. So to recap, before we kind of talk about a couple other things, when I kind of listen to the top things that you guys have outlined, population growth or the challenges within population growth is a big risk. The demographics of the state, aging population would be another one. The productivity rate of our employee base, and then the looming public financing challenge that exists within the state. Did I get those right, or did I miss the mark?
That's right.
Okay. Now you're talking to a room full of decision makers. What advice would you give all of us in this room when we start looking ahead and we start planning, we start working towards making this state better? You can't just grow a population quickly. It takes time. Before they're in the workforce for 20 plus years. What should this group be thinking about to solve some of these problems as we look ahead?
Who do you want to take?
You go.
Joe,
you go first.
You made the mistake of talking first.
Treat your labor well. And really, I think as a state, maybe one of the things we have to think about is how you begin to tilt the economy more toward innovation. I think that being sort of, and I'm borrowing conversations I've had from conversations with Jared on this, but sort of the open for business mindset, I think has to perhaps, to your point, I'm just making your point earlier, has to be sort of intentional about the nature of work within the state. I think to ensure that it is properly weighted toward innovation, discovery, creativity. I think if I may, I think our economy regionally would benefit from being more of a knowledge economy than it is now. And I don't mean knowledge economy meaning more higher ed, though we should have more higher ed. But I just mean in terms of the nature of the workforce. I think you need more human capital, not less. And I think there's a real, as I started to say at the very beginning, there is a sort of a mindset or a disposition towards startup and entrepreneurship and so on, and that's fantastic. But then I think you also have to have a labor force that is capable of innovating, of creating, of sort of having this creative, destructive process work itself through within the state. And some of that may come from the decision makers in the room, and as I joke about how you treat your labor force, but again, I suspect some of it may also come from very intentional, apolitical public policy that seeks to build that sort of labor force in the state. Again, one that really leans more heavily in the way of innovation as opposed to sort of just doing the existing work that needs to be done, which is fantastic, but also innovating so that we are also doing the new work that none of us imagines yet that needs to be done.
Very good. Jared.
First, well, I think both his points are great, right? So I'm going to expand on his first one, and then I'll expand on his second one. Treating your workforce. So if you look at sort of the labor market data, or you look at studies, the number one way that a worker can increase his or her salary is to switch jobs, right? So salary increases within a firm, if you stay there 50 years, get the gold watch eventually, that is not the best way. It's not the optimal strategy for a younger worker to increase their income. The best strategy is to switch firms, because that's when you're going to get a bigger raise, right? Everyone knows that now. And I think it's a real challenge for industry to adapt to a change in the rules of the game or change in the state of play. I mean, since the 70s, it's been a buyer's market in the labor market. It's been good to be a firm. Labor's been plentiful. Competition hasn't been that fierce. The last 2 years have really changed that. So now it's a seller's market. And from the employee side, I think the last number of years have also shown that the business isn't there to necessarily make sure the worker earns the most money possible, right? Now people have seen that. They've incorporated that into their sort of decision strategy, and so you're seeing job switching. It's increasing. It's that churn. And people are doing it for a reason, because it results in higher pay and higher income. So, I mean, that is tough for an individual firm to try and have to make that work, because it's not like every business is made of infinite profits, right? I don't know how to solve that for an individual business. Thankfully, there's a business consultant up front here, and I think we maybe talk to him later. The second thing, on the development side, how do we sort of deal with some of these things? The phrase "doing more with less," right? I'm sure everyone's heard that phrase. I think it is often construed as a cost-cutting phrase. We're going to do more with less, fewer employees. We're not going to make the investment. Somehow we're just going to do more with less. But Joe's suggestion, I think, is really great. That's doing more with less by sort of impacting the revenue side of the equation. We're going to have fewer workers, but we're going to do more. We're going to alter the workforce from a service economy to an innovation economy. And we're going to have more higher paying jobs that are in new fields that we don't know yet. And that's a way to sort of support a growing economy, by doing more with less. Higher productivity, higher paying jobs, and not having to have the great number of jobs. Think of the manufacturing metaphor of, Ford building the Model T, and you've got hundreds of workers and fashion metal, and now there's robots that are helping the workers produce more cars with fewer people, right? That's things we need to look at. And there's examples all across the state of investments, private and public investments in business incubators. There's a great one in Brookings, the Bioproducts Innovation Institute, that's going on to try and generate new and interesting businesses in the bioeconomy. So that's a great example of that. And I think that's as good of a strategy for going forward. Smart investments in high productivity industries.
You brought up the seller's market, Jared, when it comes to labor. Do either of you see that changing? When you talk about the population growth, when you talk about the demographics in the state, it seems like even if things were to loosen when it comes to that supply-demand equation when it comes to labor, even if it loosens a bit, it probably looks to be tight for a while. Am I reading that right or not?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's, as I said earlier, slow waves catch people by surprise, right? This wave has been coming for a long time for the state. You look at South Dakota's unemployment rate. I can't remember. I think in the 2010, the state unemployment rate hit 4.7%. I think that's what happened. In the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, the state's unemployment rate got to 4.7%. And forgive me if it was, plus or minus a percent, right? It didn't get to 10, right? So even when things were as bad as they've been in 100 years, 5% unemployment, right? And now we're at 2% unemployment. As a labor economist, 2% is zero. There's no unemployment. There's no lubrication in the gears of the labor market. And having that correct itself or change or move the other direction, it will eventually. But whether it does in a good way or a bad way, I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We only have a couple more minutes. Any parting thoughts that each of you have for the benefit of the group?
I suppose I go first again. Well, I think I'll start. I'll end where we started, and that was, I think you were wise, Jason, to ask a question about what is going well. And I go back to, I don't think that optimism that you talked about at cocktail parties is incorrect. I just think you have to follow it with action that aligns with the optimism. I mean, you're not going to bring it about by willing it. You have to do what needs to be done. And I go back to, this is a bit wonky, but I encourage folks to do what they're inclined to do. I think it's right to first ask, in what ways could we sort of solve this problem or challenge or whatever the issue is using the marketplace, but then do consider the possibility that perhaps the conditions that need to be in place for the marketplace to solve those problems, maybe those conditions do not necessarily hold. And I'm thinking in particular, when I say this, of what we think of as positive externalities. Are there benefits that occur from economic transactions that exceed the benefits that the individuals in the transaction recognize, right? So folks go to school, they become better citizens, they're more informed, right? We all benefit from that. That's a positive externality. And I think it's important to consider the possibility that perhaps some economic transactions yield positive externalities, and who cares? Well, when they yield negative externalities, we tax the heck out of them to stop the activity. But when they yield positive externalities, we subsidize the heck out of them to make sure that those public goods are generated, right? And so I think that's something to maybe consider going forward is, when we think about outcomes that we'd like to achieve and we reason that perhaps the conditions are not really in place for the private market to achieve them, then consider the possibility that public policy may yield a solution, again, if thought about very analytically, apolitically, and intentionally, right? But I think that's the message I would leave with the group.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Jared?
Yeah, I think I actually kind of want to give an example of an area where something like that might be possible. So we've talked about just recently some of the labor force issues that are out there. One area where there is a possibility of some sort of movement that could benefit the labor market is childcare. When you look at prime age labor force participation or prime age employment to population ratio, it's like 80-some%, I think. The reason people are sitting on the sidelines is, well, there are myriad reasons, right? One major reason is it's cheaper to stay home with kids than to pay for childcare. Or there just might not be any option for childcare. I think that's something that if the state could try and, I don't mean the state isn't just peer, but there's got to be something that can be done here because the market is not solving this problem. It's been here for years. It's getting more and more acute. I think employers know it. I think individuals know it. There's got to be some solution there that could be arrived at that would free up productive individuals to maybe join the workforce should they so choose and have the ability to actually make that decision. That's one area I think that's just ripe for exploring.
It's a good one to end on. Well, Joe and Jared, thank you for bringing your insights today, and you bring a perspective that many of us just don't get the opportunity to see, and so I appreciate you bringing that view from that altitude down to our level. So thank you very much, and really, really thank you for joining us today and giving us your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
That conversation was fascinating. Jason, thank you for bringing this expertise to this room today. As a reminder, show the love. Members, please think of someone that you would like to invite to a future meeting. Next week's meeting, we will be introducing the Riverline District. Many of you were at the press conference last Tuesday at 10 a.m., and we get the deep dive. Thank you all for being here today. Rotary is adjourned.